The flight attendant's voice rang out, cutting through the cabin air with a sharp, uncomfortable tone. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security." Her words were soaked in disdain, each syllable slipping past the polite exterior to reveal the deep prejudice beneath. Celeste Morgan, a calm, composed, black single mother sitting quietly in first class, looked up. Her gaze was steady, her voice soft as the dawn. "I've already told you, I'm not moving." There was no anger in her voice, only an unshakable determination, the kind that made everyone around her uneasy. She was humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers. But no one could have anticipated what would happen next, when the woman they all thought was nameless stood up and revealed who she truly was. The luxury aircraft was about to take off from Los Angeles to New York. Inside the cabin, a world entirely separate from reality. Perfectly adjusted, caramel-colored Italian leather seats, a mini bar with bottles of expensive champagne, and gold-plated clock frames silently ticking in sync with the soft jazz playing through the Bose sound system. This wasn't just a flight. It was a declaration of class. The door opened. A woman stepped inside. At first, no one noticed her. No entourage, no sharp high heels clicking, no Rolex watches or Hermes bags dangling from her arm. Celeste Morgan, in her 30s, tall and graceful, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. Her hair was neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, and she wore no flashy jewelry. In her hands, she held a phone and a thin laptop bag. She didn't walk fast, nor did she walk slow. She simply walked with poise, as if she didn't need to prove anything. No one realized that the seemingly ordinary woman was, in fact, the founder and CEO of Wright Skies Airlines, the airline redefining luxury and private aviation. Near the cabin door, Lauren Briggs, the head flight attendant in her early 40s, stood with a forced smile. Her blonde hair was neatly tied, her uniform wrinkle-free, and her gray eyes gleamed with a cold scrutiny behind meticulously applied mascara. She was someone who prized control, the right look, and was particularly sensitive to anything that didn't meet her standards. As the white couple stepped up before her, Lauren slightly bent forward. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. It's a true pleasure to serve you both once again." She took Mrs. Thompson's hand, beaming as though this were the most distinguished guest she'd ever had. Then came Celeste. Lauren glanced over her attire, flat shoes, dark brown skin. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a blank expression. No ticket check, no questions asked. Just a sharp, cutting remark. "Hello, I hope you're not lost." Celeste stopped, meeting Lauren's gaze. No frustration, no sarcasm. Just a quiet, powerful silence. Then she gently nodded and continued walking towards the front row. Lauren turned away, but something flickered in her eyes, not surprise, but discontent. She didn't know who Celeste was, but instinctively Lauren decided. This woman didn't belong here. Lauren turned away, but something flickered in her eyes, not surprise, but dissatisfaction. She didn't know who Celeste was, but instinctively Lauren had decided this woman didn't belong here. After escorting the Thompsons to the window seats at the front of the cabin, Lauren slightly bent over, adjusting Mrs. Thompson's neck pillow, never forgetting to flash a smile full of service. "If you need more mint tea, just press the button and I'll be right there." "You're so sweet," Mrs. Thompson replied, her eyes still fixed on the knitted bag on her lap. Lauren smiled, turned away, but the smile only lasted until her eyes caught Celeste. Pulling out her phone to check the seat number and heading toward the first-class section, a section that Lauren always considered a sacred area, reserved only for those deserving. Without thinking too much, Lauren walked quickly, blocking Celeste's path. "Excuse me," she said, her voice light but firm. "But this area is for priority passengers only." Celeste looked up, her eyes calm but heavy with meaning. She wasn't surprised. She didn't rush to react. She simply showed her electronic ticket on the phone screen and gently replied, "And I am one of those passengers." Lauren didn't even glance at the ticket code. She stood tall, arms crossed. A brief frown passed across her carefully made-up face. "Strange. I don't remember seeing your name on the list." A few passengers behind them started to take notice. Megan Sinclair, a woman in her 50s, blonde with Cartier glasses and a Chanel bag, was reading a fashion magazine but tilted her head slightly. She whispered to the person next to her, "Probably another automatic upgrade situation. Who knows?" From the other side, a middle-aged man in a dark gray suit, Daniel Green, furrowed his brow, his gaze silently observing. No one said anything, but the atmosphere in the cabin, both luxurious and tense, suddenly thickened. Celeste kept her gentle gaze, her voice as soft as honey but turning colder with every word. "Perhaps you should check the list again before jumping to conclusions." Lauren smirked, a half-smile curling her lips, laced with condescension. "I don't need to check. I know exactly who belongs here." Her words were clear, with an absolute tone, but that absolute certainty didn't come from legitimate power. It came from a quiet, judgmental mindset. Only those who looked deserving should be served. Lauren's right hand tightened around the passenger's log, but she didn't open it. She didn't need to check. To Lauren, Celeste's appearance, skin color, and humble demeanor were enough to affirm that she didn't belong in this world. A few passengers started murmuring quietly, not loudly, but just enough to create a subtle ripple of unrest in the cabin. A young white man shrugged, muttering, "If it's not the right seat, why not just move somewhere else? Why make a fuss?" Another sighed. "First class is being crowded like this." And Lauren? She stepped back, still standing in the aisle like a closed gate. Her voice was sharp, honed before takeoff. "If you don't move to your seat in economy, I will have to call security." Celeste didn't budge. Amid the underlying chaos of prejudice and rushed judgment, she stood there, like a rock in the current, silent but unshaken. "Call if you feel the need," Celeste said, her voice light as the wind, but her gaze now cold by half. Lauren hesitated for a moment. That gaze, it wasn't that of an ordinary passenger, but Lauren didn't realize. Because she'd never learned to look beyond the surface. She was only used to seeing the most obvious: skin color, brand name bags, familiarity. And it was that shallow perception that was about to lead her into an irreversible mistake. Lauren didn't recognize that Celeste's icy gaze was a warning, a boundary that had just been crossed. Or perhaps she did recognize it, but chose to ignore it. Because for Lauren, the greatest mistake someone could make wasn't in their actions, but in not knowing when to be silent in the face of her presumed power. She straightened up, turned slightly toward the cabin, her voice ringing out clearly and deliberately louder than before. "I will say this one last time. If you don't move to the back of the plane, I will call security immediately." Each word seemed to carve itself into the silence of the space, and this time, every passenger had turned their head. Megan Sinclair lowered her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, casting a half-curious, half-contemptuous look at Celeste. A man at the back of the row let out a sarcastic whistle. "So noisy. I thought first class was supposed to be peaceful." Celeste remained motionless. She didn't look at Lauren, nor did she react to the murmurs around her. She simply lifted her hand, adjusted her sleeve, then replied in a voice deep and steady like a still lake before the storm. "Do what you need to do." The words weren't defiant nor threatening. They were simply a statement, and it was exactly that simplicity that made them frightening. Lauren, unwilling to be outdone under the gaze of so many, immediately turned to the assistant flight attendant standing near the cabin door. "Grace, move her to the back. Now." Grace Holloway, about 21, with brown hair tied neatly behind her, still holding the passenger list, froze. Her eyes shifted to Celeste, then to Lauren, then to the list. Celeste Morgan's name was at the very top, in all caps, with a special annotation. Confidential. Priority status. Grace bit her lip. She wanted to speak. She wanted to hold up the list in front of Lauren and whisper, "She's on the list." But Lauren's icy gaze, part warning, part command, froze every ounce of courage in her. A moment of silence stretched on, feeling endless. Then Lauren gritted her teeth. "Grace." Grace didn't move. Her hands tightened around the list. Celeste tilted her head, her gaze not judgmental, but very real. "Do you really want to get involved in this?" Her voice was as light as the wind, yet it placed a heavy stone on Grace's chest. Lauren snapped, losing control. "She's just causing trouble, don't you see? Sneaking into first class and acting like a queen." The whispers grew louder. Passengers murmured. The discomfort spread, but this time it wasn't just aimed at Celeste. Daniel Green, the middle-aged man in the gray suit, slowly closed his laptop. He placed his hand on the seat in front of him and looked directly at Lauren with unwavering eyes. "Ma'am," he said in a warm but clear voice, "I think you should check the list again before insulting someone in front of the entire cabin." Lauren turned, stunned by the intervention. "Don't you see where she's from?" she blurted out thoughtlessly. Then, immediately realizing she had spoken out of turn, Celeste raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The same silence, the kind that made anyone facing it feel small, embarrassed, as if standing naked before justice. Grace lowered her eyes. Her hands were trembling. Lauren still stood there, flustered but trying to maintain her firm tone. I am responsible for the cabin order. I know who is allowed here and who isn't. I don't need anyone to tell me what to do." "Then why haven't you opened the list?" Daniel asked again, his gaze now as hard as stone. Lauren didn't answer. At that moment, Celeste slowly took a step back, leaning gently against the back of her seat, her eyes meeting Lauren's. "I am in the right place, Miss Briggs. And you? Where are you?" A question, not a hint of arrogance, but it made Lauren's spine shrink. Everything she was doing, she knew, wasn't following the procedure. It was her attempt to hold on to a distorted belief system she thought she was leading. But that belief system, at this moment, was starting to crack. Silently, piece by piece. The moment Celeste finished her question, "I am in the right place, Miss Briggs, and you—" The cabin fell into silence, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm yet to come, only just beginning to gather. Lauren, though her face burned with heat, tried to remain calm. She didn't respond to Celeste. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew. If she continued arguing, she would lose. Not because Celeste won the argument, but because Celeste wasn't even participating. It was her composure that drove Lauren crazy. But instead of stepping back and questioning herself, she did what those intoxicated with power often do. She tried to preserve her pride through petty actions. She turned and walked away, pressing the button for the cabin crew, her voice now sharp again. "Start the pre-takeoff service." Soon after, Lauren returned with a tray of chilled champagne placed on a silver coaster. She served in order. Mr. Thompson received the first glass, followed by Mrs. Thompson, who was smiling warmly, chatting casually with Grace. She continued down the rows. Daniel Green received the third glass, thanking her with a polite nod. Then Megan Sinclair, who smirked and joked, "I guess today we have a Netflix drama with our drinks." Lauren laughed along, though she wasn't sure whether the joke was a compliment or an insult. She kept going, all the way to the end of the cabin, then turned around, passing Celeste without a glance, not a word. Celeste remained seated. She wasn't in a hurry, didn't demand anything, didn't press the call button. It wasn't until the tray was nearly empty that she gently spoke, her voice low and polite. "Excuse me. Could I please have a glass of water?" Lauren stopped. She turned, her eyes cold as glass falling on cold wood, and then, in a voice that only those who've suffered prejudice can truly hear, the disdain wrapped in professionalism, she responded, "I'll be back after I'm done." Without another word, she continued walking, the tray of wine swaying lightly with her movements, but not as heavy as the quiet cruelty building in her attitude. Celeste didn't answer. She simply watched Lauren's back, like someone observing a psychological experiment. Not angry, not disappointed. But beneath that calm was an alertness that had been triggered. Less than 5 minutes later, Lauren returned with a new tray, this time with bottled water. She moved down the cabin, handing them out to everyone, even those who didn't need it. And this time, she was forced to pass by Celeste. Celeste was sitting upright, her right leg slightly stretched out near the aisle. A very normal, very common posture in the cramped first-class cabin. But Lauren, perhaps unable to tolerate this woman's presence for even another second, deliberately changed her direction and slammed her leg into Celeste's. That wasn't all. The water tray in her hands tilted slightly, enough to spill 3 glasses of water onto Celeste's pants and the plane's floor. The sound of glass clinking, water splashing, then the sudden silence after the collision. Lauren immediately screamed, her voice full of drama, as if she herself were the victim. "You put your foot in the way and spilled everything." A few passengers jumped in surprise, turning to look. Mrs. Thompson almost dropped her knitting. Daniel Green clenched his fists. Megan clicked her tongue. What a hassle. But the only person who didn't overreact was the one who had been drenched in water. Celeste calmly reached down to wipe the cold water seeping through her fabric pants. Then she looked up, her voice not loud, but clear enough for the whole cabin to hear. "You did that on purpose." Lauren's eyes widened. "What did you say?" "You did that on purpose. And all I ask is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight." Her words were as light as a breath, but they cut through the cabin like a blade, slashing through Lauren's thin facade of professionalism. Behind them, Grace stood frozen. She had witnessed everything, the foot, the tray, the collision, and for the first time she understood clearly this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was violence masked under a uniform. The air in the cabin still carried the scent of cold water, but that chill was nothing compared to the icy cold that passed through each gaze after Celeste's decisive words. "You did that on purpose, and all I ask is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight." Lauren stood frozen for a second. No one said anything, no one laughed, no one clapped. But it was that silence that made Lauren feel completely exposed. She wasn't used to being confronted, especially by a woman she considered beneath her. In Lauren's mind, Celeste was still just a single mother who didn't look like first class, sitting in the wrong seat and trying to cause trouble in order to get compensation. Lauren clenched her fists, her cold gaze slowly turning to panic, her voice lowering as if trying to hide her loss of composure. "Who do you think you are, speaking to me like that?" Celeste didn't respond. She gently wiped the remaining water on her sleeve, then looked up, her eyes piercing through Lauren, as though seeing right past the mascara and the fake authority. A few passengers were watching closely, including Daniel Green, the man in the gray suit whose eyes had shifted to genuine wariness. Lauren took one step, then two, moving closer to Celeste. The distance between them was now less than a meter. She leaned down, speaking in a low voice just loud enough for the front row to hear, but sharp enough to cut through the air like a razor against glass. "Don't think you can sit here and act like a queen just because you were lucky enough to buy a first-class ticket. That attitude ... She didn't finish her sentence. Not because Celeste interrupted, but because Lauren had raised her hand and slapped Celeste across the face. The sound of the slap echoed like an explosion in the confined space, like lightning striking a cloudless sky. A sharp smack rang out across the cabin, making everyone's heart skip a beat in a moment of weightlessness. Grace, standing nearby, was stunned, her hand instinctively raised to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, barely blinking. Megan Sinclair, who had been reclining in her seat enjoying the show, now found herself choking on her words, her hand gripping her Chanel bag tightly in a reflexive act of self-defense. Mrs. Thompson dropped her knitting, while Mr. Thompson froze halfway through a page in his newspaper. No one reacted in time. Only Celeste, still seated there, like a statue doused with water, momentarily stunned but surprisingly calm. Her cheek was clearly marked with a red handprint, but she didn't turn her face away, nor did she touch her cheek, as if the slap had fallen into thin air. She simply slowly turned her face back, her eyes never leaving Lauren. That gaze wasn't one of anger, nor of hatred. It only carried one thing: awakening. A moment passed, as long as a silent symphony. Then Celeste slowly spoke, each word like a stone dropped into a still lake. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Lauren stood frozen. Those words tore through the veneer of confidence she had carefully constructed. She suddenly felt something wrong, as if an invisible force had entered the room and the balance of power had shifted completely, and it wasn't in her favor. At that moment, Daniel stood up, his voice firm and clear, not loud but heavy like the hammer of a judge. "Miss Briggs, you've assaulted a passenger in front of at least 10 witnesses. Do you understand the legal consequences of your actions?" Lauren turned to face Daniel, her lips trembling as if to protest, but her throat was dry. Her hand still shook with anger, and with something else, fear. Celeste slowly stood up, not in a rush, not making any noise. She adjusted her collar, took a tissue from her small pocket, and calmly wiped her cheek. All eyes in the cabin were on her, not out of sympathy, but because everyone knew the game had just changed. Mrs. Thompson whispered to her husband, "She doesn't look like a regular passenger." Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze fixed on Celeste. "No, she's something bigger." Megan, now silent, felt a sense of something she had never experienced in first class before: guilt. Grace stepped back, but then took a brave step forward, her first courageous move in her young career as a flight attendant. She spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "Miss Morgan, I'll get you a cold towel and medical assistance if you need it." Lauren spun around, feeling betrayed. "Grace!" But this time, Grace didn't back down. Celeste gave a small smile, not big, but enough to make the person facing her step back. "It's fine. I'm okay, but I appreciate your kindness." Daniel, by now, had taken out his phone, beginning to record the entire scene. Other phone screens lit up throughout the cabin. Lauren realized, she suddenly understood that she no longer controlled this cabin, and that loss of control didn't come from a troublesome passenger, but from her own arrogance and the prejudice that had long been ingrained in her. She took a step back, then two. But Celeste's eyes still followed her, not threateningly, but like a mirror reflecting the truth. In the cabin, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of waiting. Because everyone knew, after that slap, something much bigger was coming. The silence in the cabin after the slap was as if the entire group of passengers were holding their breath, waiting for a verdict. Lauren still stood there, her hands trembling but trying to keep her back straight, as if still clinging to some shred of power in the tight bun at the back of her head. Celeste didn't rush to speak. She silently bent down and opened her phone. Her hand didn't shake. Her face remained unchanged. Only her eyes, cold and still like a winter lake, seemed to hold all the power of silence in one single action. She opened the internal messaging app, an app only accessible to senior personnel at Right Skies Airlines. A brief message was sent, devoid of anger, with no exclamation points. Serious violation. Immediate action required. I am on flight WS472. Done. She placed the phone back on the armrest. No unnecessary movements. Lauren saw it all. She gave a thin smile, but that smile was no longer a weapon. It was like an old mask hiding the anxiety bubbling up in her chest. Oh, calling a lawyer? Or planning to live stream to get sympathy from the internet? Celeste tilted her head, her gaze unwavering, her voice soft like a whisper in a dream. You'll know soon enough. A few murmurs arose again, but this time no one laughed with Lauren. No one joined in to downplay the situation. All eyes were on Celeste, no longer with suspicion but with something much closer to respect. Daniel Green, who had witnessed everything from nearby seats, finally stood up. He straightened his jacket and walked to the middle of the aisle, his eyes locked on Lauren. From what I can see, he said firmly, the one causing the disruption on this flight is you, Miss Briggs. Lauren spun around, her face flushed. She opened her mouth to argue, but Daniel continued, his tone convincing. The voice of someone who had negotiated hundreds of big deals. Not only have you violated passenger service rules, but you've assaulted a woman in front of us. No reason, no warning. And above all, you're trying to justify it with an attitude of irresponsibility. A few passengers nodded. An older woman whispered, she was right from the beginning, but no one listened. Lauren suddenly felt like she was slipping out of the cockpit of power she had built in her mind over years of serving first class. Every sharp word, every controlling gesture, every smirk that once made passengers fall silent, now turned against her. She turned to Grace, like clinging to her last ally. Grace, please say something. You saw it too. Grace slowly shook her head. She was still young, her voice not yet sharp, but for the first time it rang with real weight in the cabin. I've seen everything, and Ms. Morgan didn't do anything wrong. She only asked for respect. Lauren felt like she had been struck by an invisible blow. She took a step back, but didn't know where to retreat to. All eyes were on her. No longer the questioning gaze of passengers, but the gaze of witnesses waiting to call a lawyer. Celeste didn't say anything more. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, a blink that seemed to mark the end of all patience. Suddenly, from the cockpit ahead, footsteps rushed toward the cabin. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Ross Wellington stepped out with a clearly tense expression. He scanned the cabin, then immediately focused his gaze on Celeste. Lauren saw him and quickly spoke as if the cavalry had arrived. "Captain, I've got the situation under control. Just a disruptive passenger and—" "Silence, Briggs." Captain Ross's voice was as stern as a crash landing order. He walked straight into the aisle, stopping in front of Lauren. His gaze no longer held criticism. It was the cold, practical execution of orders. "We've just received direct instructions from upper management. The owner of flight WS-472 is currently on board." Lauren's eyes widened, and she took a step back as if struck by lightning. She stammered, "What, the owner?" Captain Ross turned, looked at Celeste, then nodded with the utmost formality. "Miss Celeste Morgan, I deeply apologize for what's happened. I am following the emergency protocol as directed by the operations office." A collective "oh" echoed from the passengers. Megan Sinclair covered her mouth, her eyes wide open as if she had just watched the final act of a play that she hadn't realized was real. Daniel nodded. "I guessed right." Lauren stood frozen. For the first time in her career in aviation, she didn't know what to do. No more excuses. No more expertise to cover up her actions. Only the truth. And the truth was standing right in front of her, vivid and undeniable. The woman she had belittled from the moment she stepped on the plane was the one holding her fate in her hands. Celeste remained seated, her posture unchanged, but without needing to stand, she had already made the entire cabin lean toward her presence. And Lauren, for the first time, felt what it was like for a life to start crumbling. All because of a slap called prejudice. Lauren stood frozen, as if pushed back into an empty void with no way out. The words just spoken by the captain felt like a sharp blade, cutting through every mask she had used to hide behind her ironed uniform. "Ms. Celeste Morgan is the owner of this plane." In a brief but intense moment, the entire cabin shook, not from turbulence but from the mental shock no one had anticipated. Celeste, the woman who had been looked down upon from the start, was not only not the intruder in first class, but was the one sitting on the throne, overseeing the entire airline they were flying with. And Lauren, who had once stood tall, given orders, judged, and ultimately assaulted, was now left with nothing but the stark reality of someone who had slapped fate without realizing she was wielding a knife with bare hands. Just moments before, when the cabin was still filled with tension and disbelief, Grace Holloway, the young assistant flight attendant, had quietly pulled out her phone after seeing Celeste get slapped. Her eyes lit up, not with rage, but with responsibility. She quickly moved toward the back of the cabin, avoiding Lauren's gaze, and dialed the emergency internal number. "This is Flight Attendant Holloway from WS-472. We have an emergency involving a VIP passenger. She was just assaulted by the head flight attendant. I repeat, VIP passenger assaulted. Her name is Celeste Morgan." The response on the other end was simple. "Received. Escalating to senior management. Stand by. Do not let anyone intervene." And less than 3 minutes later, when the cabin still hadn't regained its breath, Captain Ross Wellington appeared, his face showing the severity of the situation. He didn't need to raise his voice. Just standing there, he carried an authority not of a pilot, but as someone representing the law that was about to be enforced. Lauren instinctively blurted out, her usual confidence gone, "Impossible. She's just someone. Dressed like an employee can't be the owner." Captain Ross didn't let her finish. He spoke clearly, each word as definitive as a final announcement before landing. "She is Celeste Morgan, founder and CEO of Wright Skies Airlines. She designed the nationwide flight attendant training program, set the behavioral ethics standards for the cabin, and most importantly, she is the highest authority over all personnel on Wright-branded flights. The murmurs in the cabin immediately turned into a wave of chatter. Some people gaped, others fell silent in shame. Megan Sinclair, the blonde woman who had once mocked, now had a pale face, her head lowered, unwilling to look at anyone. Mrs. Thompson edged closer to Celeste, as if wanting to comfort her but too hesitant to speak. Daniel Green stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Celeste as though watching a mountain rise from the ocean. Lauren turned pale, her mouth dry, stepping back as though struck by her own words. I didn't know. No one told me. Captain Ross shook his head sternly. No one needed to tell you. Because company policy is, every passenger must be treated with equal respect, regardless of rank, skin color, or appearance. He paused for a beat, then continued. You are the one who violated the rules. From your unwelcoming greeting to the deliberate insults, then the physical violence, followed by obstructing a colleague who tried to intervene properly. And now, everything you've said has been fully recorded. Lauren looked around the cabin, where every passenger now looked at her like she was the criminal in a public court. She had no way out, no allies, no more authority to issue orders. Celeste, still seated, didn't need to stand. Captain Ross's words had already spoken for her. But then, she slowly adjusted her posture, standing up with calm pride, smoothing her blazer where it had been wrinkled from the slap, and turning to face the entire cabin. Her voice rang out, not loudly, but with more weight than any statement made before on this flight. I've kept quiet long enough. Not because I'm weak, but because I wanted to see how far someone like you, Ms. Briggs, would go if not stopped. She turned to Lauren, her eyes no longer filled with anger, but with the judgment that had solidified in her mind. You don't know who I am, and that doesn't matter. What matters is, you didn't even bother to treat me like a human being. Lauren opened her mouth but couldn't say a word. All that remained was the hum of the airplane's engines and the sound of her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The atmosphere in the cabin now felt like before a great storm. No rain, no thunder, but everyone could feel it approaching. Celeste remained standing, her gaze sharp but not threatening. It was the gaze of someone who had endured too much, held back for long enough, and was now beginning to act, not for herself, but for others who might face the same fate. After declaring Celeste's true identity, Captain Ross took out the intercom and spoke briefly. Request immediate emergency landing, nearest intersection, priority 1. On the other end, the voice of the air traffic controller was clear but tinged with urgency. Acknowledged, directing to Hollow Creek Private Airport. Private runway is open. In the cabin, passengers murmured among themselves. They had just witnessed the complete reversal of a microcosmic social nightmare, from silent submission to timely speech, and now to organized intervention. Daniel Green slowly sat back down, but his eyes never left Lauren. This, he murmured, will set a precedent, and I'm glad I'm witnessing it. Lauren stood frozen, her face pale, hands shaking uncontrollably. She tried to say something, but her throat felt like it wouldn't cooperate. Even Megan Sinclair, who had silently sided with Lauren before, now shrank back. No trace of disdain in her gaze. 12 minutes later, the plane landed smoothly on the private runway. The sun was beginning to set, casting the long shadow of the aircraft on the smooth black tarmac. As the cabin came to a stop, before the door could even open, a sleek black SUV was already waiting on the runway. The unmarked luxury vehicle, silver trimmed with the Right Skies logo prominently displayed on the front grille. The car door opened. 2 assistants stepped out, dressed professionally, with communication devices in their ears. They made their way up to the plane via a private staircase, their steps firm as if everything had been prepared in advance. The cabin door opened, the evening sunlight spilling into the plane, golden and cold. The first assistant bowed her head. "We are ready, Miss Morgan. The emergency meeting with the executive team will begin in 45 minutes. The car is waiting." The second assistant placed an open tablet on the armrest, displaying internal documents. The title on the screen read, "Service Ethics Violation. Urgent Processing Protocol. Code 4.7A." Celeste didn't respond immediately. She slowly turned to look at Lauren, who was still standing near the aisle like a criminal in court. She took a step forward, not quickly, not coldly, but very calmly. It was that calmness that made Lauren shiver. Celeste adjusted her blazer, straightened a loose button, then stopped right in front of Lauren. Her voice rang out, not loud, but with more weight than any statement made before on this flight. "Ms. Lauren Briggs, as CEO and founder of Right Skies Airlines, I hereby declare you are fired, effective immediately." Lauren exhaled as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. She shook her head, her eyes welling up. I didn't know I just followed procedure." Celeste furrowed her brow, but kept her voice even. "If I were an anonymous passenger, not the CEO, would you have done anything differently? Or would it have been even worse?" Lauren couldn't answer. She knew it was the truth. "We train flight attendants not to discriminate based on status, skin color, or the brand of a handbag. We train them to serve people. And today, you didn't just humiliate me. You betrayed the core values of this airline." Celeste turned to Captain Ross, her gaze calm. "I request her flight attendant privileges be revoked immediately. She is not allowed to operate on any of our flights." "Noted," Captain Ross replied tersely, pulling Lauren's ID card from her chest name tag. The sound of the card being removed made a sharp snap. But to Lauren, it sounded like the closing of a door she would never be able to open again. Lauren collapsed into the seat nearby, her face pale, her eyes unfocused, staring blankly. Celeste turned to Grace, the young flight attendant who had dared to speak the truth at the most difficult moment. She nodded at Grace, then spoke loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Grace Holloway, you've upheld professional ethics when everything around you was falling apart. You will receive an appointment letter from my office today." Grace's eyes widened, almost on the verge of tears, and she nodded repeatedly. "Thank you, Miss Morgan. Thank you so much." The entire cabin fell silent, but the looks they gave Celeste had completely changed, from suspicion to admiration, from hesitation to respect. And above all, everyone understood they had just witnessed a true judgment, not made through flaunted power, but through the calm of a woman who had begun dismantling prejudice with her own strength. Celeste walked off the plane, followed by her 2 assistants, with the evening sunlight casting long shadows on her jacket, like a beam of light guiding the way for change. The sound of Celeste's heels echoed on the cabin floor as she walked away, leaving behind the thick air of silence, heavy stares, and eyes beginning to shift in direction. But as she reached the cabin door, a trembling voice suddenly rang out from behind, pulling the space to a halt. "Wait, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." It was Lauren. Her voice was now completely different, no longer bitter, no longer authoritative, just someone clinging to what she didn't even realize she had lost, the trust of others. Celeste stopped. She turned slowly, not quickly, not startled. The The breeze from the open aircraft door brushed against the hem of her blazer, like a cold breath warning the one who had just spoken. Celeste's gaze met Lauren's, not with anger, not with hatred, but with no more tolerance. "You didn't intend to get caught," Celeste said, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "but you've shown your true face." Lauren took half a step forward, but stopped when she saw two men in police uniforms walking up the stairs to the cabin. The cabin door opened. The sleek SUV was still parked on the runway, the engine running smoothly. But now all the attention had shifted from the car to the two federal officers, neatly dressed, with badges from the U.S. Transportation Security Administration. The first officer, tall and decisive, spoke. "Hello, Miss Morgan. We've been informed of an assault that took place in the passenger cabin. Would you like to file an official complaint?" The cabin held its breath. Grace turned her head. Daniel placed his hand on the seat in front of him, his face serious. Megan had almost sunk back into her seat, her lips pressed tightly. Celeste nodded. "Yes, I will file a complaint for public assault, in front of several witnesses, on Flight WS472, operated by Wright Skies Airlines." She turned to look at Lauren, not lowering her voice, not raising her tone, but each word felt like a nail being hammered into the final door of justification. "Not because I'm the CEO, not because I own this airline, but because I am a single mother, and a human being, who was humiliated, slapped, and treated as though I didn't deserve to be here." Lauren stammered, almost ready to fall to her knees. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know who you were." Celeste interrupted. "It's because you thought I was no one that you dared to do what you did, and it's because of the hundreds of people who have been treated like I was, with no chance to speak up, that today I will be the one to speak for them, once and for all." The cabin fell silent again. Only the sound of the officers' leather shoes could be heard as they approached Lauren. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, speaking gently but firmly. "Lauren Briggs, you are under arrest for assault under Section 240 of the Federal Aviation Code. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the cabin, but to Lauren it sounded like the closing of a door she would never be able to open again. Lauren didn't resist. She bowed her head, tears falling silently, but it was too late. No words of justification could erase the looks from the dozens of witnesses, and the red mark on Celeste's cheek had yet to fade. Daniel whispered to the passenger beside him, "Justice doesn't come through promises. It comes through timely action." Celeste turned away, not looking back. She walked down the airplane stairs where the assistants had already opened the car door for her. One held an umbrella to shield her from the sun, while the other opened an iPad to let her check her schedule. But in that moment, Celeste didn't rush to get in the car. She paused in the middle of the airport, the evening wind brushing against her hair, her eyes gazing at the sky. A female passenger, who had remained silent until then, stepped out of the cabin door, calling after her, "Miss Morgan." Celeste turned back. The woman's voice trembled. "Thank you for not staying silent like so many others." Celeste nodded, her gaze softening for a moment. "We must speak out. Not for ourselves, but for those who have no voice." Then she turned, stepping into the car. The door closed gently, and the SUV drove away from the runway, leaving behind a plane where old rules had just been overthrown. As the black SUV rolled away from the runway, carrying Celeste Morgan and her assistants behind them, in the cabin slowly fading into the soft evening light, another scene was unfolding. The downfall of a person who once believed they were untouchable. Lauren Briggs, who had once walked confidently down the aisles of first class, now stood in the middle of the cabin with her hands neatly cuffed behind her back. Head lowered, hair disheveled, her face pale, as though all the blood in her body had been drained. She struggled to lift her eyes, looking out through the small cabin window at Celeste's retreating figure, tears flowing relentlessly. No longer was there the defiance, nor the contempt. Now, there was only the gaze of someone desperately clinging to something they didn't realize had already slipped beyond their reach. "Please, I need this job," she cried, her voice breaking like that of a child abandoned. I didn't know who you were." Her sobs echoed through the cabin. A cabin that had once been her stage, where she issued orders, judged, and stripped others of their dignity with the coldness learned from each fabricated lesson on luxury service. But Celeste did not turn back. From outside the cabin door, she left behind one final sentence. Calm, soft, but carrying the weight of a lifetime once dismissed. "I don't need you to know who I am. I need you to know to respect everyone, no matter who they are." Those words reverberated in the cabin like a declaration. No microphone, no stage, but every passenger felt it sink into their skin, into their very cells. And then a round of applause erupted. It wasn't clear who started it. Maybe it was Daniel Green, the businessman who had spoken up first. Or perhaps it was Mrs. Thompson, who still held her husband's hand as if to preserve a fragment of belief in humanity. But within seconds, the entire cabin joined in. It wasn't the hollow applause of a show coming to an end. It was real applause for justice. They didn't applaud because Celeste was the CEO. They applauded because Celeste refused to accept disrespect, because she dared to stand up in a place where most chose to bow their heads. Grace stood beside her, eyes red, but her gaze glowing with light. She looked at Lauren for the last time, no longer with the fearful eyes of a subordinate, but with the gaze of someone who had just learned who truly deserved respect. Lauren hung her head, unable to hide the shame. The officers led her away, silently but steadily. Their footsteps echoed evenly on the airplane floor, taking someone who had once manipulated prejudice into a place where the truth could no longer be hidden. In the cabin, the applause gradually died down, but what remained was a silence filled with awakening. Daniel gently adjusted his suit jacket and turned to Grace. "Kid, never think kindness is weakness. You did the right thing today, and that is true strength." Grace nodded softly, her hand tightening around her small notebook, where she had once written, "Becoming a flight attendant is about connecting people, not creating hierarchies." Mrs. Thompson looked up and took her husband's hand. "We should have spoken up sooner." Mr. Thompson nodded, but at least we got to see what's right happen. From the control tower, the PA system chimed. "Dear passengers, we will continue our journey in just a few moments. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The cabin seemed to regain order, but it was a new kind of order. No more suffocating atmosphere, no more veneer of formality. Instead, there was an air that felt lighter, as if someone had just thrown open the windows after hours of being stifled. Outside, Celeste's SUV had disappeared behind the private terminal, but her image, standing at the cabin door, calmly delivering her final words to Lauren, was still etched deep in the minds of those present. She hadn't yelled, hadn't slammed her hands on the table, hadn't called the media. She simply spoke the truth, and that alone had made every deceitful power tremble. The plane sat still on the runway, like a giant silently witnessing the shift of justice. The cabin inside had quieted after the applause, but within that space, a new energy had begun to rise, the energy of restored faith. Celeste Morgan, after her final words to Lauren and handing over the responsibilities to the officers, returned to the cabin. Though she could have left, she took one more step, not to show power, but to ensure that the passengers' trust was not left behind. She stood in the aisle, between the 2 rows of premium seats, her face calm, but her eyes filled with emotion, a mix of strength and compassion. "I'd like to say a few words," Celeste began, her voice carrying the weight of a quiet whisper. All eyes immediately turned to her. "I sincerely apologize for what has happened. The actions you have just witnessed never represent the service standards that Right Skies Airlines upholds. We do not serve customers based on status, skin color, or clothing. We serve people, and everyone deserves to be treated with equal respect." No one interrupted. There was no noise, only looks, brightening, nodding, silently warm. Celeste continued, this time turning to Grace, who was still standing in a corner of the cabin, her notebook tightly gripped, her lips lightly biting to hold back emotions. "Ms. Grace Holloway," Celeste called, her tone clear but not showy. "I acknowledge your courage and professionalism in a difficult situation. You stood by your principles, speaking the truth when others hesitated, and that deserves respect." Grace looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears, not tears of fear, but of gratitude and relief, as if the weight in her heart had been lifted after a long journey of maintaining her conscience in silence. "Thank you." Grace's voice trembled, but it was not weak. "Thank you for teaching me that standing up for what's right always matters, even when I didn't know where it would lead." Celeste stepped closer and placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, not as a boss to an employee, but as someone giving the young woman the affirmation that no system could offer. "I believe in you. I will personally submit a promotion recommendation for you," Celeste said, "and I will add you to the new employee training team, because we need more people like you to make this airline truly a place where no one is left behind." Grace could only nod repeatedly. The applause began again, quietly at first, then louder, this time for the young woman who had stood true to her conscience in the storm. Meanwhile, a few other passengers began whispering to one another, but no longer the mocking or suspicion from earlier. A middle-aged man turned to his wife, whispering, "I think this airline is worth keeping the membership card." The woman nodded. "At least they know how to correct their mistakes, and they don't hide it under gilded silk." A young businesswoman spoke to her assistant beside her. "Make a note of this. Her name is Celeste Morgan. I want to invite her as a keynote speaker for the seminar next month." Celeste turned to face the whole cabin. "Our flight will be taking off in about 10 minutes. The technical team is conducting a final check. While we wait, if anyone needs water or assistance, feel free to ask Grace or the new flight attendants who will be replacing the current crew." She paused for a moment, then said her final words. "I cannot undo what has happened, but I promise that from this moment everything will change. And I hope you will continue to trust us, just as I continue to trust those who choose to act with integrity, even when no one is watching." The cabin clapped again. This time for the truth, for the one who stood up, and for a future where no one had to lower their head to be respected. Outside the window, the sunset stretched across the runway. The engine's propeller began to spin slowly again. The plane, like a symbol of rebirth, was ready to take off once more, carrying a much lighter weight, having shed the injustice that had weighed down for far too long. When Flight WS-472 finally took off again, heading towards New York, the western sunset cast its final rays onto the drifting clouds below, as if covering the plane's wings with a pristine golden silk. a light that only those who have weathered a storm can truly appreciate. As passengers returned to their seats, Celeste Morgan had settled herself at the front. No longer the woman who had been insulted sitting quietly, but a leader who had just proven something more important than a title: courage and integrity. And the story didn't end in the cabin. 2 days later, a live interview was held at the Right Skies Airlines headquarters in Chicago. The special broadcast was titled "Leadership in an Era of Responsibility." Celeste Morgan sat across from the veteran host of the national news channel, a man who had interviewed presidents and top CEOs. But this time, he wasn't facing a figure of power, but a person who had touched the core of modern society through a simple yet decisive act. In the quiet studio with soft lighting and minimalist design, Celeste stared directly into the camera as the host asked the question, "Miss Morgan, what made you decide not to let what happened slide?" You could have handled it internally, without the public knowing. Celeste didn't interrupt. She listened. And when the question ended, her voice rang out clearly, not shaking, but carrying a depth that was difficult to mimic. Because respect is not a reward, it's a basic right. We cannot give someone respect because they seem deserving. We must give it because they are human. She paused, her eyes still fixed on the camera. If I were a woman with no power, no fame, no money, what would have happened to me on that flight? No one would know. No one would speak up. No one would handle it. She leaned forward, as if speaking for the millions who had been silently overlooked. We must set standards and protect them, even when the one being insulted has no voice. Because if we only protect justice when it's easy, then it's no longer justice. The room went still. The host remained silent for a moment. In the crew's earpieces, the director whispered, "Keep the shot, don't cut." She just said something that will spread. And just as expected. Within 2 hours after the broadcast ended, the clip quoting Celeste spread at an unprecedented rate. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag #respect is a right shot straight to the top trending position nationwide. The first post by Right Skies, featuring Celeste's statement, garnered over 2 million shares within one evening. Social media users wrote, "Finally, a CEO who doesn't just apologize, but does what's right." As a single mom, I teared up seeing Celeste Morgan stand up for us. No one deserves to be disrespected based on how they appear. Thank you, Celeste, for reminding us of that. A high school teacher in Texas even printed Celeste's quote and posted it in front of the classroom as a new slogan. Respect is not a reward, it's a basic right. Within the aviation industry, the aftershocks of the incident were even stronger. Major airlines like Polaris Jet, West Coast Wings, and even Titan Air issued statements pledging to review their entire internal passenger evaluation procedures and organize additional unconscious bias training for all flight attendants and customer service staff. Some airlines extended invitations to Celeste to join strategic consulting conferences, but she only accepted one more appearance, at a public service ethics conference at Stanford University, where she would not talk about business models but about the ethical responsibility that comes with being given power. And Lauren Briggs? The photo of her handcuffed in the cabin, her tear-streaked face and name tag removed from her chest, became a symbol of warning for the luxury service industry. Several airlines included that image in their training materials, with a note beneath. Discrimination is not a misunderstanding. It is a choice, and every choice has consequences. The next day, Celeste received a handwritten letter. The handwriting was a little shaky but sincere. Thank you for not staying silent like all the other times. Thank you for not waiting for us to speak up, but for standing up for us. a nameless passenger who has been through something like that, but with no one to defend her. Celeste read it, folded the letter, and placed it in the drawer of her desk. She didn't need any hero title. She only needed to know. Trust had returned. The morning after Celeste Morgan's interview went viral globally, the headquarters of Wright Skies Airlines in Chicago was unusually bustling. But it wasn't because of a crisis. Rather, it was because of a transformation starting from within, intentional, planned, and visionary. At the top floor of the modern minimalist glass building, Celeste convened an emergency meeting with the entire senior leadership team, the Human Resources Department, and the National Flight Attendant Training Head. There was no noise, no long speeches typical of old corporate culture, only serious, focused eyes, because everyone understood today was not just a regular internal meeting. This was the moment to reset the entire foundation. Celeste didn't sit behind the usual podium. She stood in the center of the room, with the presentation board behind her displaying the clear message, "Rebuild with respect. Tai Tiet Bang Ton Trong." She began in a calm but determined voice. "I don't care how much money this cost. What matters is what we become after this crisis. And if Wright Skies wants to survive in the long term, we must become a symbol of human dignity and justice, not just in the skies, but on the ground as well." No one dared interrupt. Celeste raised her hand, and her assistant activated the content for the airline's comprehensive reform plan. Mandatory, unconscious bias training for all service employees. No more brief 2-hour training sessions. Celeste ordered a series of in-depth 8-week training programs, divided by role: flight attendants, counter staff, complaint handlers, and even airport security teams. Leading experts in social behavior, public ethics, and racial discrimination research would directly assist in content development. The program's main slogan, "No one is born to discriminate, but everyone has the responsibility to recognize and correct bias." Establish a 24/7 internal reporting system, anonymous, transparent, and directly handled by the CEO's office. No more complaints buried at mid-management levels. Any reports about discrimination, disrespect, unreasonable favoritism, or threats will be classified with priority just after aviation safety. Celeste's assistant announced the new platform named Dignity Line, accessible both internally and publicly, with a user-friendly interface on both personal devices and company computers. A real-time dashboard would be displayed in the monitoring room, automatically alerting if there were multiple overlapping reports about any individual or department. Establish a new disciplinary framework, zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior. Celeste read each point as if declaring laws from a court of justice. From now on, any acts of prejudice, disrespecting dignity, or excluding customers or colleagues based on race, gender, religion, appearance, sexual orientation, or class will no longer be subject to internal review as before. They will be immediately suspended, investigated transparently and publicly, and if violations are clear, terminated permanently with no rehire in the entire system. Her voice was unwavering. No one could claim I didn't know anymore. What happened on flight WS472 had now become the standard for what should never happen again. Later that same day, the airline officially released a press statement titled, "We choose to stand for human dignity." Attached was a detailed 11-point reform plan, signed by CEO Celeste Morgan, not with an electronic signature but in real ink on real paper. Social media exploded. The hashtags #Dignity First and #Morgan Leadership shot to the top of global trends. Numerous international journalists praised this shocking but essential move as the first real action in the private aviation industry after decades of avoiding discrimination issues. A European newspaper ran a headline: "If every CEO acted like Celeste Morgan, the world would lose millions of silent sighs." Back in the cabin of WS-472, many of the passengers were now telling the story like a historical chapter, not just because of the slap, but because of how it triggered a change far beyond the plane and first-class seats. Celeste wasn't just running an airline, she had taken off again with trust. The atmosphere aboard Wright Sky's flight WS-639 from Chicago to Boston that morning was completely different. Not because of the good weather, not because of discounted first-class tickets, but because the service mindset had been transformed from the ground up. The plane was parked at a private terminal, and as the door opened, Celeste Morgan stepped aboard with the same composed demeanor as before. Dark blue suit, neatly tied hair, calm gaze, but this time the looks directed at her weren't of suspicion, but of welcome. At the front of the cabin, a woman in a Wright Sky's uniform stepped forward to greet her, a sincere smile and a look free of judgment. It was Julia Chen, the Asian-American head flight attendant, about 35 years old, with years of international airline experience before joining Wright Skies after the overhaul. Julia bowed slightly and spoke clearly. "We are honored to serve you, Miss Morgan, and on behalf of the entire crew today, thank you for changing the way we are seen and treated." There was no flattery, no fakeness, only respect from someone who had witnessed and truly understood the value of a bias-free environment. Celeste smiled and nodded gently. "I'm honored to fly with you all today." She walked into the passenger cabin. No whispers, no eye rolls, no looks judging her skin color or her outfit. Just professionalism and absolute respect. The passenger next to her, a middle-aged woman reading a book, looked up and recognized Celeste. She smiled warmly. "Hello, Miss Morgan. I'm a university professor and my students just wrote an essay about you." Celeste chuckled softly. "I hope it got a high grade." "A perfect score," the woman replied. "Because it's not just a story about aviation. It's about how one individual can change an entire structure of bias with action and dignity." Celeste slightly tilted her head, her gaze softening, knowing that every word she heard was proof of the true value of the small struggle she had once questioned whether she should begin. The flight departed on time. Julia and the crew worked in perfect harmony, with no mistakes, no signs of favoritism. Every passenger, from business people, artists, to elderly women traveling alone, was served with the same warm tone, open eyes, and professional demeanor. A young boy of color in seat 4A asked for more orange juice. Julia turned back with a bright smile. "Of course, little captain. Do you want some ice with that?" The boy's mother looked at Celeste and nodded slightly. The two women, from different backgrounds, but both understanding that today's change was something their children deserved to inherit. As the plane flew over Cleveland, the afternoon light streamed through the window, casting a glow on Celeste's leather notebook. She flipped through a few pages of work notes, but her eyes stopped on a passage she had written long ago. The true value of leadership is not in the position, but in where one stands when things get tough. It was a line she had written from a speech years ago. Today, it came alive, but not as a theory. She had lived it, and stood firm. On social media, a series of photos from the airport were shared. Celeste stepping onto the plane, being greeted, smiling in return. No one needed a live stream, no one needed to expose anyone. Just by looking at how people treated each other, they understood that this moment was different. The hashtag number Right Again began to trend, a wordplay between Wright and the airline's name, Wright Skies, as an affirmation. We are headed in the right direction. An anonymous account posted, I used to be an invisible passenger, but today I feel truly present. Thank you, Celeste Morgan. For the first time in years, I believe in this industry. Julia walked by, placing a glass of water gently on the table beside Celeste's seat, bowing her head. You may not know, but what you did helped me decide not to quit this profession. Celeste looked at her, tilting her head. We can't give up, because too many people need to see us stand firm. Julia nodded, her eyes shining in the sunlight filtering through the cabin. The plane continued its journey, but it wasn't just carrying passengers. It was carrying a future born from doing what's right. As the plane soared through the soft clouds, the midday sun reflected shimmering streaks of light off the shiny metallic body of the aircraft. Celeste Morgan rested her head against the window, her eyes gazing out into the vast expanse. The light filtered through the glass, illuminating the contours of her face, and in that quiet moment, a soft smile curled at the corners of her lips, not from self-satisfaction, but from the peace of having crossed the boundary of fear and choosing to stand on the side of what was right. Her action, seemingly just a simple refusal to give up her seat, a moment of not bowing to insult, had now become the first spark igniting a long-awaited social movement, and Celeste knew it well. She did it not because she was a CEO, not because of status, not to prove anything, but because she still carried the memories of a single mother who had been dismissed in silence. Someone who was once denied an interview just because her name didn't seem to fit the company's culture. Someone who was once asked to leave a 5-star hotel lobby just for wearing jeans while taking her young daughter out of the rain. Someone who once held back tears, unable to respond, because any reaction would be labeled as overreacting, unprofessional, or troublemaking. And today that woman dared to say, enough. Throughout her journey, Celeste received thousands of letters, emails, and messages, not from financial partners or the media, but from real, everyday people. A flight attendant who was reassigned for refusing to overlook a VIP customer's rude behavior. An Arab mother who recounted being singled out for extra security checks despite being a diamond-level member for 3 years. A black student sent a short message. You made me believe that I don't have to pretend to be someone else to be respected. Celeste didn't reply to them all, but she read every single one. Each word was a voice that had once been silenced, now rising from the ashes of tolerance. Meanwhile, Lauren Briggs, the former chief flight attendant who once thought she had the authority to decide who sits where and who deserved a smile of service, was now awaiting her trial. The case was classified as a hate crime, and it would be publicly tried. While the law would decide the punishment, public opinion had already passed judgment long ago. Several former colleagues of Lauren testified, revealing a long history of bias, sarcasm, and prejudice that had gone unchecked for years, but no one had dared speak up before. The Atlantic commented, Lauren Briggs is not just an individual wrongdoer, she is the product of a system that taught employees that civility was only for those who appeared worthy of respect. At a TEDx conference 3 weeks after the event, Celeste stood on stage, no slides, no power suit. She wore a simple white shirt and black pants, as humble as the woman she was when she began. She spoke to the hushed audience. When I was slapped on that plane, it wasn't just a physical wound. I felt like I was back in the place of millions who have been pushed out of the center of fairness. And I knew, if I had stayed silent that day, that slap would echo in other cabins, with other people, with no cameras, no influence. She paused, her eyes scanning the audience, then continued. We've become accustomed to living in a society where human dignity is something you have to earn. But no, Dignity is the starting point, not the reward. The entire audience stood and applauded, not because Celeste was famous, but because they saw themselves in her story. At Right Sky's headquarters, a new portrait was hung in the main lobby, not to honor Celeste, but as a reminder. In the picture, she wasn't standing alone. Next to her was Grace, the young flight attendant who had hesitated but chose to act. Underneath, an inscription engraved in metal read, "Those with power get to choose. Those with conscience create change." And perhaps that was the greatest message Celeste Morgan left behind after that seemingly personal incident. That what is right doesn't have to wait for us to have status to defend. That a woman, a single mother, someone once disregarded, can also be the one to change an entire system, if she chooses not to remain silent. The plane continued to glide through the sky. In first class, Celeste gently placed her hand on her phone, but this time, not to send a warning, but to send a lesson to her young daughter. You don't have to shout to prove your worth. But if anyone tries to deny your dignity, remember, all it takes is for you to stand up, and the whole sky will listen. And that was the greatest thing she had ever done, rising above power to preserve kindness for those without a voice. Celeste Morgan's story was not just a journey to reclaim justice on a flight. It was a powerful reminder that dignity does not come from status, but from the choice to stand up when silence would have been easier. A slap that seemed personal became the wake-up call for an entire system, because a woman dared to say no when she was dismissed. What about you? If you were in Celeste's position, would you have the courage to stand your ground, to choose the truth over silence? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. If this story touched you, hit like, share it with those who need it, and subscribe for more inspiring journeys. Because sometimes a silent refusal can make the whole world change.